Fox News alert: the voters of Virginia and New Jersey have spoken, handing Democrats victories in two critical governor's races, their first big wins of the Trump era. Hello, everyone. I'm Dana Perino, and this is the Daily Briefing. Many analysts see last night's victories, particularly in Virginia, as a rebuke of President Trump and his agenda. And Democrats on Capitol Hill are more optimistic today about the chances of retaking Congress in next year's midterm elections. Peter Doocy is live in Stafford, Virginia. Peter, begin where you are in Virginia. Does the Democratic governor-elect think his win was the start of a national wave?
I asked him that this morning, Dana, down in Richmond, and he said that he thinks it's too soon to tell, or that it's hard to tell. But Governor-elect Northam definitely is not in line right now with all the national Democratic figures who are saying that last night's result here, the overwhelming Democratic victory, is a sign of a big Democratic wave to come in 2018 and 2020.
I don't think that I had been, taken over by the national agenda. I certainly think there were a lot of comments being made, but this is about Virginia, Bill. It's not a national issue.
Northam got the most votes ever for a gubernatorial candidate in Virginia, and Gillespie got the second most. But Gillespie still ended up with the lowest share of any vote for Republican Virginia governor candidate since 1985. That goes to show how Democrats were just a lot more motivated last night. And I did talk to the last Republican governor who was elected in Virginia back in 2009, Bob McDonnell, who explained that the same kind of atmosphere that helped him beat Obama during Obama's first term helped Northam beat Gillespie last night.
I think it had a lot to do with Washington. I know that was true in my race, as we were able to win by a decent margin, but a lot of it was because the federal issues really worked against my opponent and really helped me win.
Democrats may have also wrestled control of the House of Delegates in Virginia away from Republicans. They've already flipped 15 seats, some of them too close to tell. And up in New Jersey, another big race, Governor Chris Christie's lieutenant lost to Democrat Phil Murphy, who will take over in Trenton next year, Dana.
And there was another election up in Maine where Democrats were basically victorious. And so the governor of Maine is talking about defying a ballot measure that passed last night that the Democrats favored. What's that all about?
The Republican governor in Maine, Paul LePage, says that he thinks the 60% of Maine voters who last night said that they supported expanding Medicaid in the state don't realize how much it's going to cost. So Governor LePage said this in part in a statement. He said, credit agencies are predicting that this fiscally irresponsible Medicaid expansion will be ruinous to Maine's budget. So he says he's not going to do it, but Democrats in Maine's House say they are going to fight him. Dana.
I can imagine. Okay. I also know that we had a lot of sort of Fox News exit polling, and yet last week we talked about this Twitter decision to expand from 140 characters to 280. They had tested it out on a few people. Now everybody has it, and I wondered what you think about it, or the voters, if you asked them.
It was interesting. The one thing that a lot of people that we spoke to last night noticed right away is that the president took full advantage of his new 280 characters right away so that he could tell Ed Gillespie from South Korea that he thinks that Gillespie should have embraced the Trump White House more, and he would have done better. But it is something that's going to have a huge impact on campaigns like last night. For the last couple months, the last couple years, there was always a difference between a campaign tweeting something that was fun and you could just mention it to your colleagues, hey, look, did you see that? Versus a press release that gets emailed out. Now, the tweets are press release sized, and so everything is kind of becoming one.
And people are just using too many words for everything. I like the old way. Peter Doocy, thank you so much for being with us. President Trump, speaking of what we were just talking about a moment ago, there was a tweet that he posted last night. It said, Ed Gillespie worked hard but did not embrace me or what I stand for. Don't forget, Republicans won 4 out of 4 House seats. And with the economy doing record numbers, we will continue to win even bigger than before. Joining me now for analysis is Karl Rove, former senior advisor and deputy chief of staff for President George W. Bush and a Fox News contributor. Karl, what is your takeaway from last night's election? Let's start with Virginia.
Yeah, first of all, the big story here is that the turnout jumped dramatically from the last governor's race. 16% more voters turned out in this election than 4 years ago. That's 368,000. And they tended to come out in the suburbs, and they tended to be independents who didn't like Trump and Democrats who were enthusiastic about sending him a message. Alexandria City, 26% more votes. Arlington, another close-in Washington, D.C. suburb, 26% of the vote up. 23% up in Fairfax, the biggest voting jurisdiction in the state. 31% up in Loudoun County, another county just outside of Washington, D.C. And what was driving them was they didn't like President Trump. 40% of Virginians approved of President Trump's performance, 57% disapproved. But take a look at this. 20% strongly approved of President Trump's performance, 1 out of every 5 Virginians. But 47% of the state's voters, nearly 1 out of every 2, said they strongly disapproved of the president's performance, and 37% said they went to vote to send him a message, and that message kept a candidate who you and I both know. He's like a brother to me. It's amazing. He got 10,821 votes more than any other Republican candidate for governor. Bob McDonald, who was on earlier in the previous hour, won by 59% in 2009, but he got 11,000 fewer votes than Ed Gillespie got last night, and getting 45.1% of the vote. The president energized the turnout. People said, this is our chance to send him a message. If we're an independent, we don't like how he's acting. If we're a Democrat, we don't like what he's doing.
Well, then, does that just follow historical precedent then? Because what Bob McDonald was saying, that in 2009, when he won, that was the Republicans coming out to vote against President Obama.
Well, it is analogous, roughly analogous in that way. But look at 2013. Democrat Terry McAuliffe won, even though that was the year before the 2014 elections that were so strong for the Republicans. So it depends on what the president does to defang the opposition inside the state. And if you're a Republican, you start out with the Washington Post against you and those Northern Virginia suburbs watching very closely what's going on in the nation's capital. But look, this was an election in which President Trump was wrong. He said if Ed Gillespie had run closer to me and been closer to the White House, he would have done better. Trump got 88% of Republicans to vote for him in the state. Ed Gillespie got 95% of Republicans and won the independent vote. What happened is that the president drove the electorate, the presidential election year Democrats, out to vote in an off-year election when they might not have otherwise voted. This election, the Democrats had an 11-point advantage over the Republicans. Last fall, when President Trump lost the state by 5 points, the Republicans were down 7 points to the Democrats on the generic ballot, and in 2013, they were down by 5. So this is a pretty dramatic increase in the percentage of the Democrat advantage over Republican, and it's largely attributable to the fact people were angry at the president and willing to vote their convictions in doing so.
So if you could pull back out in the last minute that I have with you, do you think that this has any bearing on the 2018 midterms? We know in our experience, of course, when we worked together in Bush administration, it's very unusual for a president in the White House not to lose seats in the midterm elections. There's only like 3 exceptions since the Civil War. What do you think will happen?
Well, look, the White House party tends to lose seats. What would worry me is looking at the Virginia House of Delegates, which was up last night. The Republicans had a 66-34 advantage going into last night. They're going to be lucky to end up being 50-50 in the state House of Delegates, and most of the people who lost were incumbents who did what the president said, followed his program to the T. And so we got to be very careful going into this election. The only good news is Ralph Northam is voted for George W. Bush twice. He's a physician, military veteran. He's exactly the kind of Democrat who could win votes from Republicans and independents. And he's not the kind of Democrat that that Democrats are inclined to nominate next year. He's not a Sandinista or a follower of Elizabeth Warren.
Oh, is that a new nickname? All right, Karl Rove, thank you so much.
You bet.
Now let's head over to the other side of the aisle and bring in Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen from Maryland, who serves on the Appropriations and Budget Committees. Your reaction, sir, to last night's vote?
Well, Dana, it's great to be with you.
Thank you.
I see this as the return of the Jedi after what happened last November. And I don't always agree with Karl Rove, but I agree with much of his analysis, which is this was a big win, not just for Democrats, but also for independents. And it's not just because Democrats won in New Jersey, where they were expected to win, and won in Virginia. It was the margin of victory in the Virginia race, and it was the scope of victory, right down the ballot from Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor, but also those House of Delegate races in Virginia, many of which are still too close to call. And then big wins for Democrats in the state of Washington, where we took back the state Senate, wins down in Georgia, up in New Hampshire, and many other places. Even in my state of Maryland, we had 2 mayoral elections in Annapolis and Frederick. Democrats unseated Republican mayors by large margins.
Yeah,
big turnout, a lot of enthusiasm.
I read that even in Georgia, there are a couple of state house races that went the Democrats' way as well. So given that, do you think that the successes of last night that the Democrats had would quiet the critics of the DNC and Tom Perez?
I don't know if this is going to be a question of just what's happening at the DNC, but it was clearly a very good day and good night for the DNC and Tom Perez. And, you know, at the Senate Campaign Committee, we're working very closely with Tom Perez and our colleagues in the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. You know, Dana, it's not just the backlash against Trump from last year. It's also the policy agenda that Republicans and President Trump have been pursuing in the Congress, trying to roll back access to affordable health care for millions of Americans. And I predict this tax debate is actually going to be really hard on Republicans, because as of right now, if you look at their bill, they are providing big tax breaks to big corporations, financed in large part by raising taxes on middle-class Americans.
Can I ask you about the tax bill? Because it looks like the senators are going to delay, I guess, just by a day, because they're waiting for the House to finish their markup. What do you know about how different the Senate bill will look from the House bill that's coming out?
And I really don't know the answer to that question, because the Republican senators have been putting this together behind closed doors in secret, just like we saw in the House. In the House, we learned why they were keeping it so secret, because when it hit the light of day, you had so many people recognizing that this would be harmful to them. I mean, you had groups like the realtors. We all have realtors in our neighborhoods. We have the home builders. You even had the National Federation of Independent Businesses all saying this was bad for the middle class, bad for small business. So to answer your question, I don't know what's in the Senate bill, but they are trying to cram a huge corporate tax cut into a $1.5 trillion increase in the debt. And in the process of doing that, they are really squeezing a lot of middle-class families.
Yes, Senator Scott told us yesterday that the Senate bill might look a lot different from the House bill, so maybe we can have you on next week and talk a little bit about that. My last question for you is, a Democrat on the House side, Al Green, had this to say earlier today.
I now announce that before Christmas, there will be a vote on the chief inciter of racism, bigotry, hatred, xenophobia, sexism, ethnocentrism. There will be a vote in the U.S. House of Representatives, Mr. Speaker, on the impeachment of the president.
Senator, do you agree with him on this idea of talking about impeachment before investigations are even finished? Isn't it just so premature? And could it actually erase Democratic enthusiasm gains over Republicans if they're worried that the Republican president is going to have to face this?
I don't think that that's the right way to go. I think the vote last night spoke volumes and spoke very loudly. And that was people coming to the polls in major states, in city elections, in state elections, and they sent a message loud and clear. And so the key is to keep that momentum growing and building until Election Day a year from now. And as I say, the actions of the president, the actions of Republicans here in Washington, trying to strip people of their health care and providing big tax breaks to the folks at the top, paid for by folks in the middle class. I think those are the kinds of things that we need to keep voters focused and energized. And let's let the special counsel finish his work, get to the facts, and then the country can deal with that.
All right. Well, we appreciate you coming on and telling us your point of view. We appreciate it. Senator Chris Van Hollen.
Good to be here.
A high-speed chase in pursuit of the Texas gunman. This was the end result, how it went down as police closed in on a killer. Plus, President Trump issues a stark warning to North Korea. Straight ahead, what Mr. Trump is saying today in China. China rolling out the red carpet as President Trump and the First Lady took a tour of Beijing's Forbidden City. Later, he'll meet with President Xi. They're expected to discuss North Korea's nuclear program after the president issued a stern warning to the Kim regime. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts is live from Beijing. I'm not sure what time it is there, John, but we're glad that you could be with us.
I can tell you what time it is. It's almost 20 minutes after 3 o'clock in the morning, Dana. The president begins his day in just a little more than 6 hours' time. Yeah, I know. It's like you're up all day, you're up all night. And how things go in the next 20 hours may well determine how the whole North Korean missile crisis, nuclear crisis, unfolds here in the weeks and months going forward. The president gave that big speech in Seoul, South Korea yesterday to the National Assembly, and North Korea reacting in typical understated fashion to that. Let's see what the North Korean officials are saying. Quote, the U.S. must oust the lunatic old man from power and withdraw the hostile policy toward North Korea at once in order to get rid of the abyss of doom. Like I said, typical North Korean understatement. There has definitely, though, since the president arrived here in Asia, been a shift in language, and we saw a lot of that yesterday in his speech to the National Assembly there in Seoul. No talk of fire and fury, no talk about the annihilation of a country, but the president did seem to sort of play good cop and bad cop all at the same time. There are some North Korea experts, American North Korean experts, who believe that Kim Jong-un may actually be looking for an off-ramp to get out of this nuclear crisis and somehow develop relations with the United States. Well, the president did lay out the consequences if Kim continues down the path of developing nuclear weapons, but he appeared to offer him the very beginning of an off-ramp in his speech yesterday. Listen here.
Despite every crime you have committed against God and man, you are ready to offer, and we will do that. We will offer a path to a much better future. It begins with an end to the aggression of your regime, a stop to your development of ballistic missiles, and complete, verifiable, and total denuclearization.
So as we said at the top of this, North Korea didn't take too kindly to the speech. One person who did like it, though, was Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. Thought it was a great speech, saying in a statement, quote, in blunt terms, he, the president, urged North Korea to negotiate. He also demonstrated the necessary resolve to help stop North Korea from developing the capability to strike the American homeland. It was a clear, concise, and forceful message which has been missing for the last 25 years. Again, the president begins his day with Xi Jinping in about 6 hours' time. They've got a restricted bilat. That means probably just the two leaders, maybe one or two other officials, and then an expanded bilat where they're going to get down to the brass tacks of how to get more cooperation from China on North Korea, and then also, Dana, how to address the $347 billion trade deficit that the U.S. has with China. Very busy day ahead for the president. Dana?
Yes, lots on their plates. All right, thank you, John Roberts. Get some sleep. The last moments in the life of Major League Baseball star Roy Halladay caught on video.
He just crashed right here in the Gulf of Mexico. We're literally, seriously, can't even begin to tell you this was crazy. We saw it go into the Gulf of Mexico, literally.
What authorities say. Tax reform dividing GOP lawmakers as Senate Republicans reportedly considered delaying the corporate tax cut for 2 years, setting up a potential conflict with their colleagues in the House. Joining me now is Larry Lindsey, former economic advisor to President George W. Bush. I imagine, sir, that they would also have a problem with President Trump at the White House if they decided to delay. You've just met with some of the senators. What do you know?
Well, I wouldn't talk about what I met with the senators about, but, you know, I think that the a phase-in or a small delay really wouldn't hurt economic growth that much. There's some planning involved, a new investment. So, for example, if you didn't have it take effect January 1, I don't think you'd affect many decisions. You could ramp it down over 2 or 3 years. That would actually encourage investment on net because people would want the deduction now and then pay the tax later. So I do think that this is a problem that can be solved.
What would be the reason for a delay, though?
Oh, I think it's an issue of revenue. They're stuck in conforming to the $1.5 trillion 10-year static score. And there's a lot of things that senators want. There's a lot of things that House members want. A lot of things the president wants. And fitting them all in the same box sometimes requires maybe, giving up room by one thing to make room for another.
Do you think that, in your opinion, should the members try to eliminate the Affordable Care Act individual mandate, as the White House has suggested and some members of Congress want to do?
Well, I think that's a political judgment. I don't think the individual mandate is a good idea. Whether or not you want to do it as part of this bill, I think is a political choice. Depends on where the votes are. That is way above my pay grade, Dana.
Oh, no, your pay grade's pretty high. What do you know about the president's call to Democrats? Does he expect any of them to come on board, or was that a call just to say, look, we'd like to have your support, but if you can't be there, it's okay?
Well, I think that was the latter. I mean, look, this is an existential bill for both parties. The Republicans have to pass it in order to deliver to their base and in order to keep the economy going. We're late in this recovery. And unless the bill passes, unless all the optimism that has been generated by President Trump's election, has some substance behind it, we face a decline in the economy. Republicans have to pass it for their own political survival. But for the same reason, Democrats don't want Republicans to survive, and I think they're going to be very, very hard about ever considering passing the bill.
Then what would be your most valuable lesson that you learned in trying to pass tax cuts in 01 and 03 that you could pass along to them?
Well, I think that maybe there should have been more of a consensus earlier. What happened in 01, as you well remember, the president campaigned on a very specific tax cut. Mm-hmm. So he had a mandate to do it. This president really didn't campaign on anything specific. And so I think a lot of time was wasted actually negotiating a final product. And that's why here we are sitting in November without a bill through. But that's water over the dam, and there's nothing that can be done about it. We are where we are.
All right. Larry Lindsay, thank you for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Authorities just releasing the names of all 26 people who died in the Texas church massacre as we get more troubling information about the gunman. Plus, brand new Fox News voter analysis giving us a closer look at what led to the Democratic victories in two key elections last night.
We live in a very diverse society. It is getting more diverse every day. It is that diverse society that makes this country great.
In Springs, Texas, a short time ago, where he'll attend a prayer service that's scheduled for tonight. Meanwhile, police are releasing the names of all 26 victims in that deadly shooting, and their names are running at the bottom of your screen. One of the victims was an unborn child. Brian Yennis is live from Sutherland Springs. Brian, what's the latest?
Good afternoon, Dana. Well, investigators reportedly have video from inside the church at the time of the shooting showing the gunman methodically executing churchgoers, shooting even children in the head. The video is said to show shooting lasting for about 7 minutes. This church routinely videotaped its services. This, as a Defense Secretary Jim Mattis says that he's ordered the Department of Defense Inspector General to investigate why the Air Force did not turn over the shooter's domestic violence convictions to the FBI National Background Check Database, which could have blocked the shooter from legally purchasing his 4 weapons. A slew of missed red flags, missed opportunities to have perhaps prevented this, including an El Paso police report detailing his escape from a mental health facility in 2012. We also now know he threatened his military superiors with death threats and tried to smuggle weapons onto an Air Force base. This is new video from one of 2 Good Samaritans that chased the shooter in the moments after the suspect crashed in the getaway. The Comal County Sheriff's Office also says they are reviewing whether they mishandled a 2013 sexual assault investigation in which the shooter was a rape suspect. Apparently, the shooter, they believed, after 3 months of investigating, had moved to Colorado, and that investigation stopped. Dana?
Really interesting, Brian. What do you know about what's being done to help the victims' families at this time?
We've seen grief counselors here. They've been at vigils, they've been at schools and at homes. They've been here just trying to help this community cope with such a devastating loss. 26 faces that you see on your screen there. And then there's the emotional support canines. They have been on scene, also at schools, helping people just give some sort of levity or just letting them cry with these canines. We know that these canines have been requested especially by the first responders' families who showed up on the scene, just a terrible, horrific scene, and they've been helping them. Listen.
When they saw the dogs, it was a chance for them to just pet. And as one of them said, this is the first time I smiled in 4 days. And in that process of petting and hugging the dog, they open up and they talk about what they've gone through. And a key part of the healing process is to be able to talk about what you've been through. And dogs become that safe thing to do that.
Those canines are from the Lutheran Charities. We also have an update for you. The 73-year-old Farida Brown was released from the hospital today. Earlier this morning, we know that we spoke to her son yesterday on your show. She was sitting in the back of the church when the gunman first came in. She suffered 4 wounds, and David says that she's doing really well and hopes to dance once again.
Oh, well,
Dana?
we'd love to see that, and we'd love to have her on the show at some point. Thank you so much, Brian. So Democrats winning big last night in Virginia and New Jersey, where voters were focused on the issues as much as they were on the candidates. Josh Holmes is a founding partner at Calvary LLC and a former chief of staff for Senator Mitch McConnell. Mac McLarty was White House chief of staff for President Clinton. Good to have you both on the show. It's easy to overinterpret results in an off-year election, especially an off-year election like the year after a presidential election. But let me start with you, Mac. What do you think last night's results tell you about what might happen in 2018 with Democrats?
Danny, you're right. One election does not make a spring, so to speak. But I think this is a potential harbinger. These were both purple states. They perhaps leaned slightly Democrat, but not much. And the margins were pretty substantial. I think Colorado also had some Democratic wins. And you also, Dana, saw some victories at the local level in state legislatures and other elections. So I think it's clearly kind of the snapback effect, which is not too surprising in our political landscape. We've seen that for the past several years.
Josh, do you think that Ed Gillespie in Virginia, the Republican, should have run a different kind of campaign in order to beat Ralph Northam?
It's awfully difficult. You know, Ed Gillespie was in one of those situations where you're the first election after a presidential election. We saw this in 2009 with Democrats after President Obama's election. You know, where you are in your campaign literally is at the mercy of the national environment. And in this case, in Virginia, it wasn't good news for Ed Gillespie. I think there's a couple of important takeaways here. One, the turnout, right? I mean, anytime you have higher turnout in an election like this than any time over the last 20 years, you got to pay some attention to it. And it wasn't that there were more Democrats that just kind of came out of the woodwork and Republicans stayed home. Republicans turned out too. The difference is in the suburbs, in the Loudoun counties and Fairfax counties, and the places where you need as a Republican to carry in order to win statewide, they all went Democrat. And I think that's something that Republicans are really going to have to look at.
Let me have you look at this Fox voter analysis poll. This is pretty interesting because voters were looking at the issues. In Virginia, the most important being health care and the economy. Going on to New Jersey, they said taxes. And of course, you know, it's New Jersey, corruption and government. And then Virginia voters' feelings about the health care law was that it didn't go far enough. And so, Mac, what does that say to you about the policies going forward? You know, Ralph Northam, you know, he voted for George W. Bush twice. He's not the type of progressive far-left candidate that a lot of the people of the Democratic Party kind of like, you know, the Bernie Sanders type.
Well, I think Josh nailed it in terms of turnout. The energy is clearly on the Democratic side, and the fact that Josh made the point that there was a pretty substantial Republican turnout as well, I think underscores the fact that the energy is on the Democratic side. I think, Dana, it suggests that there was a return to kind of the responsible candidate. And I think that won the day. And it also suggests that President Trump's policy positions, as well as his temperament and style, are not playing as well as he might like. That clearly was a negative in Ed Gillespie's campaign, who was an establishment candidate in many ways, and that just did not bode well for him.
So then how important is it, Josh, for the Republicans to try to pass tax reform and have President Trump sign it if they want to maintain confidence of the voters and to win in 2018?
It's critically important, Dana. And if you look at the counties that I just mentioned, Loudoun County and Fairfax County, the Republican majority in the House is literally built on districts that look a lot like those two counties. And look, the bottom line is they've squeezed all the blood out of the stone that you can get by polarizing the two parties. These voters, more than anybody else, vote pocketbook issues, and there is no currency in stupidity, right? They like competence, they like accomplishments, they like getting things done. If Republicans can get a tax package through, I think it does a lot to remedy their situation. If not, this is going to be a huge problem.
Well, Josh Holmes and Matt McLarty, I'd love to have you back. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Dana.
Thanks.
This is a Fox News alert. New video is emerging that appears to show the moments before star pitcher Roy Halladay died in a plane crash off the coast of Florida. Phil Keating is live in Miami. Phil.
Dana, according to TMZ Sports, witnesses say the All-Star pitcher had been flying aggressively over the Gulf all week long, making dramatic rises in altitude, then a speedy drop down close to the water, then shooting back up and doing that over and over again. Now, Roy Halladay, the legendary pitcher of the last couple of decades, he'd only had this new plane for about the past month, an Icon A5, and he once tweeted he loved flying it low and fast over the water because it made him feel like a fighter jet pilot. A small group of guys fishing in the Gulf of Mexico yesterday shot this video, which TMZ Sports obtained after they said the pilot of the plane was showboating. Once they saw the plane go down in the water, they rushed over to look for any survivors.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Stunned disbelief as the fishing crew pulled up on the Halladay's upside-down plane. They mentioned to call 911 and then quickly realize there were no survivors. The National Transportation Safety Board is now on the scene just west of Tampa, now in charge of the investigation, having the boat towed back to shore just a couple of hours ago. Halladay's plane was one of these, the Icon A5, as seen in Icon's own promotional video. The two-seater amphibious plane is small and tight and flies like a race car. It only takes a less rigorous sports pilot's license to fly one. As a pitcher, he became just the 20th person in Major League Baseball history to pitch a perfect game, and he was an 8-time All-Star. He played for the Toronto Blue Jays, then the Philadelphia Phillies, and everyone who knew and played with Halladay has had nothing but the utmost of compliments. His plane crashed just after noon yesterday in shallow Gulf of Mexico waters not far from where Halladay had retired northwest of Tampa. The sheriff says there was no mayday call made and that the ace pitcher was flying alone. Roy Halladay leaves behind a wife and 2 young boys, which everybody who knew him said were just the loves of his life.
What a terrible, terrible story. Phil Keating, thanks for bringing it to us. So some college athletes could be in serious trouble after getting arrested in China, and at the center of it, one of the biggest families in basketball. Plus, after offering an olive branch to North Korea, President Trump now ramping up the rhetoric.
The more successful South Korea becomes, the more decisively you discredit the dark fantasy at the heart of the Kim regime.